hope I haven't forgotten. So I'm going to start introducing Eret this time. So Eret Talviste is a part-time researcher at the University of Tartu in Estonia and a commissioner for equal treatment in Tallinn University. She's working on turning her PhD thesis on strange intimacies in Virginia Woolf and Jean Rhys into a monograph. Her current research focuses on two areas: on Estonian female novelists in the 1920s and 1930s in the context of transnational modernism, and on affect and post-human theories when reading Anglophone modernism. She has written essays and reviews about intimacy, feminism, and literature for Estonian cultural magazines and academic journals, and has upcoming academic articles on similar topics in international journals. So, Eret, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So, yeah, thank you for this introduction, and I'm very happy to be in this panel on To the Lighthouse. And I'm going to talk about wonder mostly today, and also kind of the ethics of it. So I'm going to start by situating the scholarship, or like situating the idea of wonder in the larger scholarship of knowing and not knowing, then give some examples of how wonder appears into the Lighthouse, then talk about the rainbow myth, and then come back to the ethics of wonder. All right. My slides aren't working. No. Wait, give me a moment. Can you see my, okay.
You know,
you can see my slides now, it's the next one. Okay, sorry. A bit different than what I'm used to. But anyway, so as we know, the question of knowing and not knowing is present in Woolf's fiction, as we also heard in the first panel of the conference that I actually couldn't attend, but I will look at the recording later. And I see the sense of wonder and the activity of wondering as part of this larger topic of knowing and not knowing. And into the Lighthouse, in my opinion, this is related to the question of what constitutes intimacy. So Lily famously wonders, begin quote, "For it was not knowledge but unity that she desired, not inscriptions on tablets, nothing that could be written in any language known to men, but intimacy itself, which is knowledge." So this citation is full of contradictions. On the one hand, knowledge is the opposite of intimacy, and on the other, intimacy is knowledge. So ultimately, or it can be concluded that what this passage reveals is the fact that intimacy is often elusive, and the desire to know is perhaps itself intimate, and not knowing creates an intimate desire to know. Or to put it differently, intimacy entails a perpetual state of wondering about the other. And also wondering about the other kind of creates intimacy. So it's this kind of two-sided thing. And this idea will be important to bear in mind, because in the end, I'll come back to the idea of Mrs. Ramsey, whom this passage is about. So Lily wonders about Mrs. Ramsey, and to the ethics of wondering. How can I go back? Wait. Sorry, it's a bit different than, okay. So the word wonder in either verb or noun form appears in the novel 54 times. And it's present already on the first page. We learn that the possibility that the weather will be fine, quote, produces extraordinary joy in James, and it was the wonder to which he had looked forward. And throughout the novel, when you think about it, I think you can kind of remember that Mrs. Ramsey wonders about her children, about the core of darkness. Lily wonders about intimacy, as I said. Mrs. McNabb in To the Lighthouse, in the Time Passes section, wonders about how life endures despite kind of everything that happens. And Mr. Ramsey also wonders about, somewhat ridiculously, about his legacy, and so on. And so what I think is that from these different wonderings, different kinds of affective atmospheres of wonder are conjured. So to me, for example, the window, the first bit, wonder is often an anxious wonder about the future and about people and the interpersonal relationships. In Time Passes section, it is a metaphysical wonder about what life is, what perishes, what not, what lasts and what won't. And this kind of metaphysical wondering is articulated in a daily manner via Mrs. McNabb, but also via non-human forces that seem to be wondering as well about similar things. And in the final bit, which is the Lighthouse, wonder has become a kind of positive and life-affirming force, which carries life onwards, and it's associated primarily with Lily and Cam. So wonder then is central to the novel both as a verb and as a noun. So as I've also been indicating with this idea of wondering and this ing in brackets. The wonder as an activity of thinking and wonder as an experience. So there's a distinction between the verb I wonder as something we primarily understand in cognitive terms and the noun wonder as an affective experience. But this distinction is not as clear-cut into the Lighthouse because thinking is not rational, calculating activity only, but also wondering, wherein wonder maintains its more effective state. And I would stop here and speak about this a bit more, but I won't because I think this is kind of exciting. So in terms of, so I'm going to focus a bit more on the, not on the cognitive side, I think, although, as I said, they are related, but more on the affective state of wonder. So I want to turn to the Greek myth of the rainbow. So we know that Woolf had a knowledge of Greek myths and also the work of Jane Ellen Harrison. And Jane Ellen Harrison used to, I can't remember the citation needed, but she used to write about the rainbow myth as well. So it is likely that Woolf was familiar with the rainbow myth, that of Iris. So rainbow is Iris, the goddess of the rainbow. And important for my talk here is also the fact that Iris's father was Thaumas Wonder, who was an old sea god, the son of Gaia, who is the earth, and Oceanus, I don't know how to pronounce it, sea. And for example, you can think here how the Lighthouse is kind of set at the edge of the world, where kind of between the sea and the land, or the characters often go to the sea and get something from the sea, perhaps. Or, you know, yeah, the land and the earth kind of have a certain dialogue. So in the myth, Thaumas marries Electra, and their union produces Iris, the rainbow, who is the breathtaking messenger of the gods and the supreme wonder, linking heaven and earth. As a goddess, Iris is associated with communication, messages, and new endeavors. And Iris is apparently often accompanied by Zephyrus, who is the god of the west wind, and her husband. And here I'd like to remind you that when Mr. Ramsey kind of, you know, kills the possibility of going to the lighthouse, then the wind is said to be due west. So in short, wonder has this daughter who is associated with awe. And I think into the lighthouse, we do have this sense or feeling or atmosphere of awe, perhaps particularly towards the non-human life. But then Mary Jane Rubenstein, who is a philosopher, reminds us that besides this element of awe, wonder also has another side, that of terror, as Thomas and Electra had more daughters, whirlwinds, also known as the harpies. And here I go to the next slide. So there are these harpies as well. So these two senses of wonder are hinted at in the novel, as Mrs. Ramsey is reminded that the awesome, I couldn't find a better word than awesome, or comforting part of wonder is ephemeral as a rainbow, when the monotonous fall of the wave clashes on the beach and makes her look up in an impulse of terror. And the harpy actually appears into the lighthouse as a thing that descends on Mr. Ramsey, that fierce, sudden black-winged harpy, with its talons and its beak all cold and hard, that struck and struck at you. And also, so apparently in the Greek mythology, and I really don't have a good knowledge of Greek mythology, but harpies didn't appear as horrible at first. They were kind of okay. And then later on, And also because of Virgil and how Virgil depicted harpies in his writing, they became these like evil creatures. And we know that Virgil is quite important, or depends how we look at it, but you know, he's there into the lighthouse. So while I'm talking about all this, so in my opinion, there are these implicit and scattered references to the idea of wonder and also maybe to the rainbow myth into the lighthouse. And it might be said that the rainbow side is associated with Mrs. Ramsey. So we can think about, you know, Lily wonders, you know, she's the center of the novel in some ways. And there's also her beauty that is wondered about, her pearls, and also she's kind of writing letters all the time. And something that I don't have time to talk about here is also the fact that her pearls, so, you know, pearls are kind of like white, or some pearls have this kind of prismatics about them. So there's also an interesting link between Jane Goldman's work on feminist aesthetics of color and prismatics and light and dark. And also Derek Ryan's work on the granite and rainbow, or this kind of, you know, solid and non-solid things and how it relates to that. But this is just like a reference. And I also want to say that it's not my aim to read Mrs. Ramsey as a kind of symbol of Iris. It would be way too simplistic, but it's more the idea that there's something about her that is related to the whole novel, that is related to wonder. So what I want to suggest is the fact that all these elements about Mrs. Ramsey, combined with her myopia, create a certain sense of ethical wondering and wonder in the novel as a whole, and also reflect a certain aesthetic mode of Woolf's writing, maybe. So in the final part of the novel, Lily continuously returns to an image of Mrs. Ramsey on the beach. Begin quote, Mrs. Ramsey sat and wrote letters by a rock. She wrote and wrote. Oh, she said, looking up at last at something floating in the sea. Is it the lobster pot? Is it an upturned boat? She was so short-sighted she could not see. And then Charles Stanley became as nice as he could possibly be. And I think in the last part of the novel, this is the moment that Lily looks back to continuously, and that is like very relevant for her painting as well. The way she sees her painting, the way she finishes her painting, it's kind of like she thinks about that moment a lot. Instead of thinking about the moment that Mrs. Ramsey thought that everyone would go back to. And I think that this, you know, this focus on Mrs. Ramsey's myopia or short sight, it's often read as her heteronormative conventionality, but in the context of wonder, her myopia becomes ethical, or it can maybe be seen as ethical. And here I'm drawing my ideas largely from Hélène Cixous, who talks about myopia as a kind of opening up a certain intimate engagement with the world. So Mrs. Wonder keeps wondering because she cannot be sure what she's encountering. Her sight is too short for that. She keeps looking, trying to understand. So the other remains forever worth wondering about for her. And it is precisely this sense of wonder that Lily seems to express towards Mrs. Ramsey in return. And also more generally towards life and art as well. So when at the beginning of the novel, she thinks that supreme knowledge or intimacy or intimate knowledge must be stored in Mrs. Ramsey, or rather not at the beginning of the novel, but at the beginning of this talk. It might be precisely that ability to pay intimate attention to the other. And Lily takes this to other spheres of life, not just the domestic sphere. And also when we think about reading Mrs. Ramsey in the light of wonder becomes telling when it's contrasted with Mr. Ramsey, at whom harpies descend. So for Mr. Ramsey, Mr. Ramsey is scared of the terror element, or for him it's terror element of not knowing. So he's scared of not knowing, whereas Mrs. Ramsey and Lily maybe happily wonder, unlike the philosophers. And also wonder is something that is kind of a well-known topic in philosophy, but maybe not so much thought about in relation to modernism. So Lucy Irigaray, for example, claims that what is lacking in the discipline of philosophy in terms of passions is wonder. And Irigaray, like many contemporary philosophers and critics, remind us of the motivational primary force of wonder, which is the first passion and is indispensable not only to life, but also still to the creation of an ethics. And also Jane Bennett, who is actually very influential for my thinking, proposes that ethics, any kind of ethics, requires an effective engagement with the world. So this intimate engagement with the other, whether it's human or non-human, which results in a sort of mood of enchantment. And this mood of enchantment is very similar to what I mean about this kind of state of wonder and wandering into the lighthouse. So to sum up, so wonder, when it is all like opens up instead of closing in the world, it allows to keep wondering. It is unlike the harpy that descends on Mr Ramsey and stops him from wondering. So ethical wondering is or could be concerned with the awesome side of wonder, as it embraces the potential of not knowing or being myopic. And I can, if you have time and if it goes in that direction in Q&A, then I also just found out how many references in other novels Woolf makes to wonder. So it's, I can talk about this later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Eret.
Yeah, I'm trying to stop my share.
Yeah, I don't know if I can do that as well or not.
No. Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm very blind. Okay. Thanks.
No, that's fine. It's okay. It's always these technological glitches. Yeah, thank you very much. It was a great presentation. So let's, yeah, I think we can move. Let's say you can, of course, gather your thoughts in a few seconds. You can already type your questions to the chat, and we will slowly move to our second speaker. And this is Paula Brinkley, who is a graduate assistant at Lamar University. She teaches Composition 1 and integrated reading and writing and tutors at the Writing Center. She has served as the chief editor for Pulse Literary Magazine. Her interests are Greek mythology, in modern literature, poetry, feminism, and rhetoric. Paola will graduate in December 2022 with her MA in English. And today she's going to give a presentation called Possessions of the Angel in the House, a Dionysian reading of Tudor Lighthouse. Great, so if everything works, Paola, good luck. You should unmute yourself, don't forget about it.
Sorry, I had a bunch of tabs open, so I couldn't find my way back to Zoom.
That's okay.
Okay. So can you see my presentation?
Yeah, we can see. Yeah, and now it seems that it's full screen even.
Okay, and I also put a link to my Access copy in the chat. So if anyone would like to follow along, it's there for you. And before I start, I'd like to say thank you for this opportunity to speak here and to participate and listen in scholarly conversation, because this is my first conference. So I'm just learning a lot from everyone, and of course, learning a lot from participating. And I'd also like to give thanks to Dr. Smith, my professor. She has helped me a lot with putting this together. She has read so many drafts, so I'm eternally grateful for that, because as we all know, the first draft doesn't look anything like the final draft. So, okay, so the title of my presentation is Possession of the Angel in the House, a Dionysian reading up to the Lighthouse. In her 1931 essay, Professions for Women, Woolf describes the angel in the house as a phantom, intensely sympathetic, immensely charming, utterly unselfish, a force that she must kill because it would have plucked the heart out of her writing. The angel sacrifices herself daily to maintain patriarchal hegemony and demands that all women follow her example. As Mary Beth Pringle, Shannon Forbes and other scholars have argued, Mrs. Ramsey in To the Lighthouse is an angel in the house figure. More specifically, she appears as a woman caught in the angel spell and acting as its agent, both victim and victimizer. In this way, Mrs. Ramsey resembles Agave and Euripides the Bacchae, a woman possessed by Dionysus and forced to sacrifice her child. In this paper, I explore a comparison of the possession of Agave and Mrs. Ramsey by outside forces, which they nonetheless become complicit. I demonstrate the emergence of toxic femininity in a patriarchal society. Doing so reveals a more nuanced understanding of Mrs. Ramsey's agency as victim and victimizer within English patriarchy. Woolf rewrites the myth of Agave in To the Lighthouse to criticize the effects of Victorian gender ideology. Despite Nancy Warman's claim that Woolf does not appear very interested in Euripides because his plays do not align with the modernist taste for the primitive aspects of Greek tragedy, and Jane Ellen Harrison's focus on the ritual aspects of the genre, in this paper, I argue that Woolf engages critically with the Bacchae, a play that Warman admits is the only play Woolf expresses strong feelings for. In the Bacchae, Dionysus returns to his birthplace, Thebes, to claim his rightful worship banned by King Pentheus and to avenge his mother Semele's defamation. When Pentheus and his mother Agave denies Dionysus' divinity, the god drives Agave and the women of Thebes into madness and compels them to worship his rites on Mount Cynthron. Dionysus enchants Pentheus into entering the woman's sacred taboo space and makes him appear as a wild lion whom the women attack and dismember. Agave decapitates her son and triumphantly presents his head on a spear to her father Cadmus as a display of her powers as a huntress. At this moment, Dionysus cruelly awakens Agave from her possession. The Bacchae draws on myths about Maenads, female practitioners of Dionysian ritual, who were depicted as driven mad by the god into unfeminine behaviors, sexual fairs, dancing, singing, and hunting, outside the domestic spaces allotted to women. But Maenads were also depicted as mothers who fostered young animals and cared for male children, and Dionysus himself was raised by these Maenad nymph-type figures. In this, the Maenads echo the dual nature of Dionysus, who is both the liberator and the hunter, the duality of which is emphasized in Euripides' play. In Dionysus' Myth and Cult, Walter Otto writes that in her madness, the mother nurse becomes a bloodthirsty beast of prey and tears into the pieces of a young life which loves most dearly. Like Agave and other Maenads, Mrs. Ramsey acts under the influence of an outside force, the angel in the house, to enact the sacrifice of her own children. Specifically, Mrs. Ramsey encourages young men and women to conform to restrictive Victorian gender roles. She casts a spell on them all, leading her victims, especially Paula, to the altar of both marriage and sacrifice. Her daughters desire a life different from hers, not always taking care of some man or other, but they can only sport with infidel ideas like this in silence. Knowing that she will shepherd them into their traditional domestic roles, she unconsciously poisons her daughters with this ideology, that their happiness can only be found in marriage. So her daughters may continue to uphold this social order, which requires the repression of their sons and daughters, maintaining this vicious cycle. Mrs. Ramsey performs what Sarah Ahmed terms gender fatalism, the belief that girls will be happiest when they get married. And her daughters experience the injunction to be happy in this way, as Ahmed describes it, a form of pressure that is oppressive. In the third section of the novel, after the deaths of Mrs. Ramsey, Prue, and Andrew, Lily Briscoe blames Mrs. Ramsey for leaving her alone with her husband. That man, she thought, her anger rising in her, never gave, that man took. She, on the other hand, would be forced to give. Mrs. Ramsey had given. Giving, she had died and had left all this. In this moment, Lily casts the blame for Mr. Ramsey's emotional exploitation of her onto Mrs. Ramsey, emphasizing her active role, giving, and indulging her husband's insatiable appetites. By refusing to limit him through her endless angelic self-sacrifice and intense sympathy, Mrs. Ramsey nurtured the monstrous aspects of her husband leaving him to victimize other women. Mrs. Ramsey's death frees Lily from the stifling charms of the angel. And unlike Prue, Rose, and Nancy, Lily can pursue her own life path. Lily struggles to paint in the novel's first section mirrors the effect of the angel on Woolf's writing and professions for women. As soon as Lily picked up her brush, the demon set on her. 1,000 forces did their best to pluck her vision from her. Woolf's language is a near perfect echo in the essay where Woolf kills the angel because she would have plucked the heart out of my writing. It is only after Mrs. Ramsey's death that Lily can finish her painting, triumphantly declaring, "I have had my vision." Lily wrestled with the angel to assert her own creative vision over the angel's desire for conformity. In The Phantom Gone, Lily, having a mind of her own, can express herself honestly through her creative work and in her relations to the people around her. Woolf reiterates this idea in Professions for Women as she writes, "For, as I found, you cannot review even a novel without having a mind of your own, without expressing what you think to be the truth about human relations, morality, sex." Under the charm of the angel, women cannot explore or express their views. When the angel is overcome, women have the power to communicate their ideas honestly, as demonstrated through Lily Briscoe's completion of her painting. Mrs. Ramsey as the angel supports male power, but her love and protection of the whole of the other sex also infantilizes them, creating emotional dependency. As Lily notes, she pitied men always as if they lacked something. She creates a fantasy world of comfort and security for men whom she loves because they have power, for the fact that they negotiated treaties, ruled India, controlled finance. From her position of powerlessness and her unwillingness to challenge patriarchal ideology, Mrs. Ramsey nevertheless claims some power for herself through her role as angel. As Woolf writes in Professions, women must charm, they must conciliate, they must, to put it bluntly, tell lies if they are to succeed. This charming deception echoes Deborah Gough's description of Mrs. Ramsey as exuding that fatal enchantment which draws men ever further into its toils, like a siren luring man onto his doom. And thus, Mrs. Ramsey is a dual image. She is man's longing for beauty and an image of its betrayal, a symbol of life and a lie. Like Goethe, I see Mrs. Ramsey in her guise as the angel in the house, as exercising a fatal enchantment over men and women that lulls them into compliance with patriarchal hegemony. This is clearest in her relation to her husband. Mr. Ramsey constantly needs approval and sympathy from other people, and Mrs. Ramsey provides this pseudo self-esteem. After his wife dies, Mr. Ramsey is lost, looking for something to fill this void in his life. He looks to Lily Briscoe and his daughter Cam, but they refuse to deliver. Because he cannot rely on the fantasy world Mrs. Ramsey created for him, Mr. Ramsey continues to dump his emotions haphazardly in hopes that some woman will pick up the pieces. Mrs. Ramsey enchantment works alongside more overt forms of patriarchal indoctrination, such as education, to ensnare her sons as well. Andrew's upbringing and education indoctrinate him with toxic masculine ideals of martial heroism. His death in World War I is bracketed as a casual afterthought, demonstrating how insignificant his life becomes after he has served his purpose. After Mrs. Ramsey's death, despite his resentment towards his father, James becomes more and more like him and desperately needing praise and recognition. Unable to get the attention he craves from his mother or sister, he immediately gives us his commitment to fight tyranny to the death when he feels praised by his father. In James' transformation into his father, presented through the rebellious Cam's eyes, we see the effects of the training he receives from his parents' marriage. Despite his early hatred of his father's emotional dependency, he seems destined to repeat the patterns laid out for him by their dynamic. As we have seen, Mrs. Ramsey's uncritical allegiance to Victorian patriarchal ideology and her efforts to gain some amount of power and self-worth for herself within that system leads her to coerce and train her sons and daughters into reproducing it in their own lives. from Andrew's death in World War I to the compulsory marriage he pushes on the young people around her. Yet, there are a few moments into the Lighthouse where Mrs. Ramsey shows doubt about the way she exercises her influence over others. In a moment of reflection, Mrs. Ramsey regrets pushing Minta and Paul into marriage. Was she wrong in this? She asked herself, wondering if she had indeed put any pressure upon Minta. She was uneasy. Was she not forgetting again how strongly she influenced people? When she sits down to dinner in chapter 17, she thinks, but what have I done with my life? And could not understand how she had ever felt any emotion or affection for her husband. But her thoughts do not translate to action, since this is not a thing that one says. Feeling the pressure to perform her angelic duties, knowing that if she did not do it, nobody would do it, she gives herself a little shake that one gives a watch that is stopped. The old familiar pulse began beating as the watch begins ticking, and she is back online. Looking at William Banks and mustering the familiar pity she feels for men, she began all this business once again. In these recurring moments of self-doubt, Mrs. Ramsey breaks with her angel role, revealing her possession by this phantom. As Shannon Forbes writes, in Mrs. Ramsey's eyes, the desire to be accepted by men, and therefore to marry, and the desire to be independent for the sake of pursuing modern womanhood drastically conflict, with no hope for compromise, and in subscribing to one, a woman consequently must wholly reject the other. The glaring inconsistency then between Mrs. Ramsey's desire to be an angel in the house and a modern woman illustrates the wretched situation of the Victorian woman who desires to seek acceptance and was therefore coerced into being the angel. Like Lily, Mrs. Ramsey wishes to make her own contributions outside motherhood, specifically through social work and political advocacy. But as she looks upon Lily, she reminds herself there is security and comfort in becoming a wife and a mother. It is easy to imagine Mrs. Ramsey having been coerced into her role as angel in her Victorian childhood, since, as Woolf writes in 3 Guineas, marriage and motherhood was the only career available to women. In this dual role of victim of the angel and perpetrator of that victimization upon others, and in the inconsistency of Mrs. Ramsey's moral agency, I believe that Woolf is referencing Agave, one of Euripides' famously complex tragic heroines. Just as Agave is compelled to sacrifice her son under the influence of Dionysus, Mrs. Ramsey is compelled to sacrifice her children to patriarchal hegemony under the influence of the angel in the house. Andrew's death is equivalent of Agave placing her son's decapitated head on a spear and presenting it as a trophy. His education has prepped him as a sacrificial victim for the angel, as he is led to believe that the occupation of war is a noble pursuit. Likewise, James, though he does not follow Andrew into war, has been encouraged by his mother into his father's emotional dependency. The angel compels Mrs. Ramsey to seek feminine success in charming, conciliating, and lying to men, and this relation between the sexes allows toxic masculinity to thrive and flourish. As scholars have shown, Woolf usually adapts and revises the classical material on which he draws. Her engagement with the Bacchae is no exception, as Mrs. Ramsey sacrifices not only her sons, but also her daughters to the angel's demands. As in the Bacchae, Mrs. Ramsey's refusal or inability to deny the angel leads to the sacrifice of her sons and daughters. She fosters toxic masculine traits instead of addressing them, and she forces her daughters to do the same. This creates a vicious cycle of repressing men and women, and the angel, like Dionysus, requires blood. In Professions for Women, Woolf describes her struggle with the angel as violent, requiring the death of either her independent life and mind as a writer or the death of the angel. Like Woolf in that essay, Lily liberates herself by killing the angelic aspects of Mrs. Ramsey. Mrs. Ramsey, like Agave, makes a blood sacrifice of her children, Prue and Andrew, and of the independent lives of her other sons and daughters. Upon Agave's cruel awakening from her Dionysian madness, she asks Cadmus why her son had to die for her sins. Cadmus' response reveals another of Wolf's revision to the myth. Cadmus explains that he, like you, blasphemed the god, and so the god has brought us all to ruin at one blow. You, your sister, and this boy, all our house, the god has utterly destroyed, and with it me. Having raised her son to reject the divinity of Dionysus, she trains him into sacrilege and brings his punishment upon him. Unlike Euripides, who depicts Agave's tragic blasphemy and indoctrination of her son as occurring prior to her Dionysian possession, and therefore is justifying the god's punishment, Wolf rewrites the possessed woman motif in a more sympathetic way, drawing readers' attention to the impossible bind faced by Victorian women. While Wolf seems keen to portray the generational trauma inflicted by the angel-possessed mother, she also repeatedly shows the way in which Mrs. Ramsey unsuccessfully tries to break with her patriarchal training and the woman behind the mask. Wolf's adaptation of Agave figure is tragic in a different way than Euripides' character, and her juxtaposition of Mrs. Ramsey with the younger Lily seems more hopeful. She sheds light on the ways women may unconsciously play a role that upholds the patriarchy as they seek comfort and safety for themselves. Wolf balances the pressure of living under patriarchy with a message of responsibility and awareness that women are culpable for their silence and complicity, showing us the ways that, in the words of Audre Lorde, your silence will not protect you. It is only in risking security and comfort and taking responsibility for our own contributions to social inequality that we can move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paola. That was great. I really liked how your and Eret's presentations were interrelated with this Greek mythology. It was perfect. Okay, so well done. So let's take a minute just to gather your thoughts. You can already type the questions into the chat, and then we will proceed to our last presenter. Okay, so let's start. So our last presenter is Christine Darrohn, and she's Associate Professor of English at the University of Maine at Farmington. Her research centers on Victorian and modern British literature with an emphasis on representations of the possibilities and difficulties of forming human connections across social barriers. She has published articles on Virginia Woolf and Catherine Mansfield that focus on class, gender, the Great War, and hospitality. And today she's going to give a presentation entitled Flashes of the Charge of the Light Brigade into the Lighthouse, the Ethics of Intertextuality. Okay, so Chris, is everything working?
I think so.
Okay, perfect.
Did you see my slide?
Yes, definitely the first one.
Great, great. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So wonderful to be here. A panel completely devoted to the Lighthouse is like the most delicious thing I can imagine. So I'm thrilled to be a part of it. I have shared a link to my paper if you prefer to read along as I speak. As Mr. Ramsey recites the charge of the Light Brigade, imaginatively joining the famous cavalry charge that is celebrated in the Victorian poem, Mrs. Ramsey, and let me try to get another slide up. There we go. Mrs. Ramsey gives meaning to words which she has held meaningless in her mind for a long stretch of time. This paper explores the meanings that Wolf gives to the words of Alfred Tennyson's poem and the ethical dimension of Wolf's intertextual strategies. It is obvious, as other readers have noted, that in incorporating the charge of the Light Brigade, Woolf explores the character of Mr. Ramsey, and she challenges traditional ideals of heroic manhood and military valor. But what has not been adequately tracked and pondered is the percolation of Tennyson's words through the novel, near and far from their direct quoting. Even as Woolf's novel challenges Tennyson's poem, it also embraces its words. In this complex field of textual distinctions drawn and dissolved, we can probe the fundamental ethical dynamic of how one being positions itself in relation to another. So let me start very briefly by talking about the characterization of Mr. Ramsey. And this is very brief because it's been covered so well throughout the scholarship. The charge of the Light Brigade obviously limns the character of Mr. Ramsey. Mr. Ramsey's pleasurable identification with the soldiers crystallized in his changing the poem's pronoun they to we when referring to the brigade, reflects one of his central traits, his anxiety about his achievement and legacy. For this poem is certainly about achievement and legacy. It honors the Light Cavalry Brigade, which suffered tremendous losses at the Battle of Balaclava in 1854 during the Crimean War. Specifically, it lauds the soldiers' brave dutifulness in performing unflinchingly a doomed military mission. And the poem suggests, in a rhetorical question, that their glory will not fade. Another trait of Mr. Ramsey, solipsism, is manifest as he, thoroughly engrossed in his military fantasy, is willfully heedless to the people around him, eventually colliding with Lily and William Banks in a farcical echo of the fatal collision of armies in the battle. Woolf, bringing the charge of the Light Brigade into her novel, exposes traits and failings of Mr. Ramsey, and she does more. She challenges the poem's ideals. Many readers, including John Morton and especially Shuli Barzilai, have noted this, and others as well. The challenge is most potent and poignant, arguably in time passes, especially in the death of Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey's son, Andrew, during the Great War, a death that contrasts so starkly and somberly with Tennysonian martial death. And here is the reference, which I'm sure you all remember. Andrew's death is, quote, mercifully instantaneous, not a Tennysonian epic destination in which one attains glory. Wolf's soldiers do not act. Instead, within the passive construction of a sentence, they are the objects of the shell's action. In stark contrast throughout Tennyson's poem, vivid verbs denote soldiers' actions. Most striking of all, the indeterminate number of soldiers in Woolf's novel evokes war's careless disregard for the individual, in contrast to the clear-cut numbering of the soldiers in Tennyson's poem, with its refrain of the 600 at the end of each stanza, a number that is emphasized by the poetic structure of 6 stanzas and 6 lines in the final stanza. Incidentally, the newspaper accounts that Tennyson was reading and that inspired his poem were not consistent in tallying the number of soldiers. He noted that, he fretted over it, and ultimately he seems to have chosen 600 because he liked the meter of 600. That's a tangent, but maybe an interesting one. Overall, though, getting back to Woolf, Woolf represents war's destruction of human agency and precious individuality, a destruction to be lamented, not celebrated, in the elegiac core of her novel. Thus, To the Lighthouse rejects the ideals of the Charge of the Light Brigade and the tradition of celebratory martial literature. My review of all that has been a little bit, more than a little bit condensed, again, because I think it's covered so beautifully in so much of previous scholarship. So now I come to where I feel like maybe I can start to move us maybe in some new directions. Because Tennyson's poem is not merely spoofed and rebuked. Instead, in addition, its language is embraced. Some of its individual words, which capture elements of its worldview, appear in the novel beyond direct quotations. They percolate through the novel. In terms of ethics, and in particular, the most fundamental ethical matter of how one being relates to another, we can say that the poem is welcomed into the novel, and welcomed not treacherously just to be scorned. The poem and the novel are other to each other in their outlooks, yet textual intimacy is formed as the poem's language joins with the narrator's language. We see this, for example, within the chapters in which Mr. Ramsey recites the poem and words of the poem reappear in the description of Mrs. Ramsey. One of these words is flash. This vivid verb is used twice in Tennyson's poem, flashed all their sabers bare, flashed as they turned in air. And it's part of this very vivid, dynamic representation of war, the kind of representation that it seems Mr. Ramsey is so drawn to and gets so wrapped up in. Although those precise lines are not quoted in the novel, the verb does appear in the novel in a mashup of various lines and parts of lines, which I have on the right column near the top there, where it is capturing Mr. Ramsey's thrilling sense of heroic fighting. Beyond that mashup, though, when Mrs. Ramsey gives her husband sympathy and validation that he craves, Flash describes not soldiers' sabers, as in the poem, not an amorphous martial brilliance, as in Mr. Ramsey's fantasy, but rather knitting needles. And I bet you're recalling this, I'm sure. 3 times in the space of 2 paragraphs, Mrs. Ramsey flashes her needles, which she is using to knit stockings for an ill boy, while she simultaneously reassures her husband and tends to her young son. Here, Flash transmogrifies Tennyson's field of combat between armies into a frictional domestic space in which a wife endeavors to sustain physically and emotionally family and neighbors, even when their needs conflict with each other's. Another word from the poem that is featured in the description of Mrs. Ramsey at this point is shell. This word appears in the first of the poetic lines that is included in the novel, a line that appears twice in Tennyson's poem, Stormed at with shot and shell. And in the poem, it is, of course, describing the lethal danger faced by the soldiers. Woolf repeats that word with a different meaning, but similar import, to describe the figurative lethal impact on Mrs. Ramsey of her devotion to her family. There was scarcely a shell of herself left for her to know herself by. At this point in my argument, it might seem that Woolf supplants Tennyson's dutiful, brave soldiers with a devoted wife and mother, deploying the poem's language to subvert the poem's ideals. She does do that, but the intersection of the poem and the novel is richer than that. And the stance that the novel ultimately takes toward the poem is more complex. We can recognize this when we notice how widely the poem's language moves through the novel. And the slide on your screen now presents just a few examples. But if you look in that right column and you're looking at the page citations, you can see how spread out they are, even in just this selection of examples. In the interest of time, I'm not actually going to focus on these, but rather I want to return to Flash, which describes much more than Mrs. Ramsey's knitting needles. In regards to Mrs. Ramsey, it also describes that sudden idea that she has that Lily and William Banks should marry. Much later, it describes Lily's epiphany about her painting. And then it describes William Banks' view of his scientific work. Similarly, it describes the intellectual work of genius, according to Mr. Ramsey, who recognizes he is not a genius, but strives to be very accomplished nonetheless. In these places, Flash refers not to valorous military combat, but to various acts of creativity, social, artistic, and intellectual. Flash describes non-human activity as well. For example, and you'll see it in that slide, it describes stars. The expansive range of flashing activity is signaled in the first use of flash in the novel, but something moved, flashed, turned a silver wing in the air. The echoing of Tennyson's line, flashed as they turned in air, is unmistakable. But whereas sabers flash in Tennyson's poem, Woolf opens up the possibilities of what flashes. Although the context of Woolf's sentence suggests a bird, the indefinite pronoun something allows for nearly limitless possibilities. The manifold percolation of flash through to the lighthouse, including even more instances than I have reviewed here, creates a dispersed yet linked array of acts of human and non-human vitality. The novel clearly challenges the glamorization of warfare in the charge of the Light Brigade by counterpoising these non-martial acts. Yet the acts associated with flash into the lighthouse are not unequivocally validated. The novel certainly questions Mrs. Ramsey's proclivity for matchmaking, as Paola has been really helping us to be mindful of. In the framework of my thinking about flash, I would draw attention to this, I think, very impactful echoing use of flash, which accentuates this questioning that the novel invites. Mrs. Ramsey's idea that William and Lily should marry had flashed upon her, but Lily's artistic epiphany to move the tree in her painting had flashed upon her. And that flash for Lily enables Lily to feel she need never marry anybody, and now she could stand up to Mrs. Ramsey. The flashing actions of To the Lighthouse, rather than simply substituting one kind of act for Tennyson's, present abundant possibilities and invite us to explore and to ponder. What are the acts that we should honor? And I've taken that word from the last stanza of Tennyson, honor. What are the acts by which we should define ourselves and give meaning to our lives? The significance that Woolf gives to Tennyson's flash, as explained here, is compounded as she handles other words of the poem: dismay, blunder, plunge, wild, and even more. To conclude, To the Lighthouse disagrees with the charge of the Light Brigade. There's no mistake about that. It's sharply disagreeing with the poem. but it does not discard the poem. On the contrary, the charge of the Light Brigade is embraced, its words flashing in the narrator's discourse dynamically, surprisingly, perpetually, expansively. Both alterity and intimacy, key terms in 20th and 21st century theories of ethics, come to my mind as I try to capture the complex relation between the charge of the Light Brigade and to the Lighthouse. The two texts are other to each other, yet into the Lighthouse, they speak and think together. Today, a time when public discourse is so divisive, so dismissive, the intertextuality that I have explored here suggests an ethical vision that is sorely needed. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you very much. I'm amazed by this lexical analysis of the novel and the poem and how they go together. Perfect. Okay, so let's take a second or a minute. We have approximately half an hour for a Q&A session. So let's just gather our thoughts first. I'll scroll up the chat if there is some question, but I don't think so. Yeah, so I'd like to thank for these amazing presentations, which were pretty much interconnected. So we had like two views on the female characters, then one mainly masculine view, I would say, even with the charge of the Light Brigade. And so I am inviting you to start with questions if there are some already. Yeah, okay, I can see Stacey, so please.
Thank you. Thanks for these wonderful papers. They interconnected so richly. I have just maybe a comment for Chris and then a question for Paula. Chris, thank you for unpacking just the wonderful imbrication of that poem in the novel. And what you said at the end there about kind of disagreeing without discarding seems to me, you know, in keeping with the whole way that Woolf is engaging with Victorianism in the form of the family through the novel, right? You know, my students often say, well, is she rejecting her parents or is she, you know, elegizing them and loving them in this novel? And the answer is both of those things. And I think her relationship to Tennyson, as you so wonderfully demonstrate, is just like that, right? I mean, she loves the Victorians and she hates the Victorians, and all of that gets in there in that complexity. So I just wanted, that's just a comment really. Paula,
I agree.
Oh yeah, yeah. So I mean, I just think you so beautifully pulled that out through the language in a way that makes me see new things. So thank you for that. And then Paula, I thank you very much for really opening up the way that Mrs. Ramsey is not just sort of forcing the women and girls in the novel into conventional roles, but also really helping to produce the toxicity of masculinity in her husband and Charles Tansley and her sons, which is something I think I hadn't fully recognized before. And I really think that's really a helpful insight to have. I did want to ask you about the question of Lily freeing herself from Mrs. Ramsey in order to complete her painting. I mean, in one way that seems exactly right, but I wanted to ask you, about the persistence of Mrs. Ramsey and the role that her, phantom presence actually has in helping Lily complete her painting, because there's that moment when the shadow appears on the step, somebody's in the dining room. That's a really key moment in allowing her to complete the picture, because it fills that space where Mrs. Ramsey was. And then there's also those moments when Lily is feeling very critical of Mrs. Ramsey and feeling that she's freed herself from her influence. And then suddenly Mrs. Ramsey reaches out and wrings her heart and she cries out, "Mrs. Ramsey, Mrs. Ramsey." So I kind of wonder what you think about that in terms of whether Lily has actually killed her off or not.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Mrs. Ramsey, to me, like, although in this paper maybe I painted her like an awful human being, certainly she like perpetuates these norms, but like you also have to think that like these norms were also forced upon her, and like she probably felt like this was the only way for like some kind of safety was to continue perpetuating these norms. So with like Lily having this ambivalence toward Mrs. Ramsey, it's like she appreciates like how strong she is, because at the same time, although she isn't like perfect, she deals with a lot. She takes on so much responsibility. She has to make sure that like Mr. Ramsey doesn't lose it, that the guests are being attended to, that, I mean, as soon as she enters the room, everyone looks at her. She's like almost very like, I won't say seductive, but like, yeah, I guess in a way she is. So it's like, I think Lily's ambivalence is kind of like her recognizing like the dilemma that women have to face. It's like, kind of like, should we continue doing these norms and maybe we won't be like criticized, but at the same time we still will be. I don't know. It's kind of, it's an interesting perspective to look at. I don't think I answered your question.
Yeah, no, I think that, I mean, calling it ambivalence seems right. And I mean, you're kind of, I think it's right that she's seductive and that Lily is seduced often by her. I mean, she's Lily's muse. But it might be interesting to think about what role ambivalence has in helping Lily complete her painting, is I guess what I'm asking, is that it's not as clean as having killed off Mrs. Ramsey, but there may be something about the ambivalence that allows Lily to make that line across the painting, that she's connecting something or maybe separating something. So anyway, just it's a hard question, and I just thank you for clarifying. And I thought your paper was wonderful.
Oh, thank you, and thank you for that question. It's definitely making me think more about that.
Yeah,
thank you. Yeah, Amy, you're
back on that. So I of course I read and helped Paula with her paper, and in so doing, Stacy, that is I'm really glad you brought our attention back to that, because in working with Paola on her paper, I forgot my own writing. So I mean, I agree completely. I think there's a lot of ambivalence. I think Paola was right about that. And I think that there's a lot more to Mrs. Ramsey. Her kind of divine qualities, the ways that she is like a goddess, are both sort of dangerous enchantments, as Deborah Goff points out, but also not just that. I think it's really key to the inspiration. There's a really spiritual sort of quality that is really important in Lily's work, that she has to kind of balance this resistance and absorption. And that is a very tricky element of the novel that it took me many years, just Paola to point this out, took me many years to come to that conclusion. Many years of reading the novel to come to that conclusion. But yeah, Stacy, thank you for pointing us in that direction, because I think it's a really great thing to keep in mind.
Thanks. I think Jane was next with a question.
Yeah, I've got another question for Paula. I thought it's really good that you were talking about the rereading of the myth and to Woolf extending it and adapting it, which ties some of the papers together, adapting it to include Mrs. Ramsey sacrificing her daughters as well as her sons or her son. Could you say a little bit more about Prue and how she is sacrificed and victimized? Because I think it fits in really nicely with your argument, but perhaps you didn't have enough time to tell us much about Prue.
Yes, thank you for asking. So Prue is, I believe, like forced into marriage as well, because at the beginning of the novel, when they talk about it, of course, they group the daughters together. It's not just Prue. I think they say Nancy, Rose, and Prue, that they wanted to, you know, have adventures and not be forced into marriage. But like what Mrs. Ramsey does with Minta and Paul, she kind of forces onto Prue as well. And Prue is not like, she's not indirectly, it's not like Mrs. Ramsey's like directly killing her, because I believe she dies from childbirth. But it's kind of like she was forced into this, and it wasn't actually like her decision to say, hey, I want to start a family, I want to get married. It's not actively her making those decisions. So it's kind of like indirectly almost sacrificing her. That's what I thought of it as.
No, I think that works really well. And there's that line when, obviously it's to do with Minta and Paul, when Lily thinks, you know, that Mrs. Ramsey's sacrificing victims at the altar, and of course, altar is a place where obviously, you know, victims were literally killed and sacrificed, but it's also a symbol of marriage, you know, coming to the altar. And so, you know, that somehow I would always read it that Prue becomes a victim too, that Mrs. Ramsey's led to the altar. And I suppose she wouldn't have died in childbirth had she not got married and tried to start a family. So I think there does seem to be some link. And I love the line when, again, it's in the brackets, when Woolf says that, you know, Prue is given in marriage. And it's not said, oh, she's marrying this man and this is it. It's just she is literally sacrificed up to what's going to become her death very, very shortly, a couple of pages later. So yeah, it's quite an interesting character there that furthers your argument quite nicely. So thank you very, very, very interesting paper.
Thanks. And I think Gabrielle is next.
Thank you, everybody, for such an interesting and, as I said, very thought-provoking panel. I had some questions, especially for Eret. Am I saying your name correctly? I hope so.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I love the way, first of all, you were tracing all of the many, many instances of wonder and wondering through the novel. Thank you for giving us that gift. And then also your notion that intimacy itself entails a perpetual state of wonder or wondering about the other and about alterity. But what I wanted to ask you about especially was your wonderful point through Hélène Cixous about the opening to a certain engagement with the world through myopia. So in other words, it's through a so-called disability that actually one is able to have a better ability to make certain connections and have a certain openness to what you're calling wonder, what you're exploring as wonder. So that's one part of the question. And I was also wondering if you see a significant difference between wonder, awe, and curiosity, if you might talk to that. And adding on one more thing, please do not feel you need to answer all of these at all, but at least just thoughts. Somebody in my panel yesterday brought up Woolf's short story, The Mark on the Wall. And I'm not sure if you remember it, but in that the whole little short story is predicated on Woolf's own myopia or inability to see what this mark is on the wall. And she's sitting contemplating, what is this? What could it be? She doesn't really want to get up and actually look at it. And then we go into this whole stream of consciousness that takes us to all kinds of other places while she's ruminating on what the mark could be. And then at the very end of the story, it sounds like Leonard, probably Leonard, we don't know, a man. If it's biographically read, it would be Leonard. Actually, it doesn't have to be a man. Somebody comes in to the room and says what it is and has this very intimate kind of conversation where they just pick up wherever they had left off and makes a comment about the news and the state of the war. But that's another place where myopia is an opening, in fact.
Yes, thank you for these very rich questions and comments. And I was listening to your the panel that you were in yesterday. So I guess specifically, just thought before I tried to answer some of it. I also started thinking about the idea of wonder more in kind of like, you know, the spiritual, mystic, religious terms, although this is not something that I have been paying attention to so far. But I think I can kind of tie the, you know, the idea of myopia as kind of disability. This was the first part of the question, right? I've never thought about it as a disability, but when you mention it, it does make sense. And it is, and I have been thinking about the mark on the wall as well, and this idea that, and I think Woolf has it in other places in her fiction as well, when a character sits somewhere and is staring and can't understand what it is in the distance. And I'm not sure if I can answer about the disability thing. I see that Amy has pointed out in the chat that myopia can be seen as the opposite of empiricism or empirical observation. I guess that makes sense to an extent, but then it's it's another mode of seeing, I think. And then when I made the reference to Jane Goldman's work on the feminist aesthetics of Virginia Woolf and the light and dark and the kind of, the light being, and I guess the light brigade can be maybe drawn into this discussion from that angle in an interesting way. It's always, the light is always associated with masculine. And this also comes from Hélène Cixous, I think. And she actually, I think Goldman draws her ideas from Cixous, where the sun is the masculine and then the dark is the feminine. So there's this idea of not seeing in a kind of, this empirical, I guess, way. But then there might be this other way of like knowing or seeing. And I'm not sure what it means exactly, but I guess it's, the idea of like seeing otherwise in terms of not even seeing or trying to pay attention more. I don't know if that answers what you had in mind at all.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
And then about the curiosity, awe, and wonder, I have read about it. It's been like, it's sitting there, this paper, in a longer form, in a kind of chapter/article form. So I've read about the idea of wonder in philosophy and theory. And it is related to curiosity, awe. And I mean, awe, I think, is, at least in Rubinstein's thinking, awe is one side of wonder, and then the other side is terror. So these are the kind of like, it's a mix of awe and terror. And so in my opinion, for Mr. Ramsey, not knowing is this kind of terror side of wonder. And for Mrs. Ramsey, it's the other side. And I think curiosity, I don't know what other people have said about it, but to me, it is related. I mean, it is, trying, but it's also related in the sense that if I can't see, if I don't know, then I'm obviously more curious. But it's also the kind of attitude of when do you think you know everything? I think it's one of the ideas is also that, I think one of Woolf's ideas is also that there will never really be like this absolute point when a person knows everything. So it's the idea of being able to keep wondering is related to that. And it is related to curiosity as well.
Yeah, it's almost as if wonder in a sense is curiosity plus enchantment. In a sense,
yeah.
But it also depends very much on the context of the sentence, because like you showed, sometimes if it's being used as a verb, someone was wondering, it can actually be very casual and not have the same connotations of such enchantment.
Yeah, and I think especially like I think your presentation actually yesterday made me think about the fact that there's so much about defining how we understand these things. So, you know, I think I have focused on this wonder as a kind of affect, I think, and, you know, this atmosphere, mood, encounter, something like this. But yeah, the definition, I think, really depends on the situation and what we as readers also want to get out of it, I guess.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. I can't see any more questions, but if I may, I would like to ask Kristin as well. I really liked your idea how you pointed out that Woolf embraces actually Tennyson's language in the novel, and particularly how she uses this kind of military vocabulary to describe Mrs. Ramsey. So I noted down those two expressions like flashes, her needles, and shell of herself, and so on. So do you think that Woolf intentionally uses this language to point out at Woolf's own masculinity and this like toxic femininity, which might tie nicely with what Paula said in her presentation? And are there many more instances like these where Woolf uses Tennyson's vocabulary to describe Mrs. Ramsey?
So thank you for that question. I mean, I think what I would say is, when one sees this language moving from Tennyson's poem into the description of Mrs. Ramsey and into other descriptions, for me, it just creates this field in which I, as a reader, I feel I need to ponder all this. I need to mull it over. I might be tempted when I first see those flashing needles, right, to say, oh, okay, so here we have a toxic female, just like the toxic, men. Or I could immediately, I think, go in a different direction and say, oh, wow, all right, so this is the alternative, right? So if you're not wielding a saber, right, something that's designed to cut, and instead you're wielding needles, which are designed to pull things together to create something new, right? I could say, whoa, okay, no, this is the alternative, right? We can be sort of valorous in our acts of creativity. And here's a female character represented as doing that. But ultimately, because there's all that other flashing going on, and we get other language, you know, just sort of spilling out in all sorts of places, I don't even want to land on one or the other of those. I feel I need to just sort of constantly be in this state of like perpetually seeing new possibilities and perpetually seeing those possibilities in relation to the others in new ways.
Perfect, thanks. Yeah, I think it really adds to this general ambivalence and ambiguity about the novel, even the language now as you gave us your interpretation. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
I just want to make, this is just a final kind of comment. These papers were so exciting for me. I mean, they were just, I'm just saying this as a conference organizer. Thank you. This panel has been really, really exciting and generative, and I'm sure not just for me. I can tell from the questions. Your research is beautiful and meaningful. So thank you very much.
And I saw Jane that she had her hand up.
I did, and then Amy sort of said a final comment, but if you wanted to.
Of course.
I was just wondering with Chris, if you'd thought of the performative element of the poem as well, because, you know, Mr. Ramsey in that scene, he is charging around, he is the Charge of the Light Brigade, reciting Tennyson's poem, as of course Leslie Stephen would go around reciting Tennyson, and that sort of fragmentary way in which the words kind of impinge upon other people, and sometimes it's to their annoyance, and sometimes it's a slightly comic way in which, you know, he in sort of a soldier charging, he's kind of charging almost like bumping into other characters. And I just wondered if you thought about how that element kind of throws lights on how this poem is kind of disseminated across the novel.
Yes, I'm not sure I can pull all my thoughts together on that, but it's so central, right? So, this isn't one of those places where we're seeing a character in a room reading something, right? This isn't when we're seeing James cutting pictures out of, right, the catalog. This is performance. And I think that's important. One of the things that makes it so important is, I think, what you've highlighted there, this kind of ludicrous sort of overlaying in a reader's mind of, the charge of the Light Brigade is all about performing, right? And performing exactly the way you were instructed to do, even though someone had blundered, right? There was an error in the chain of command, and you're heading in the wrong direction. But it's about performing. And so we have that, and overlayered on that is, Mr. Ramsey so much performing that he almost knocks over Lily's easel. He does bump into Lily and William Banks. I guess what I would say is, one of the things that strikes me in making this so performative and in a really dynamic way, so not just standing and speaking and maybe even just moving your arms around like I am right now, but like really, being mobile, moving around. Wait, where was I going with this? I really actually think I have forgotten where I was going with this. It might come back and it might not, but it's performative, it's in motion. Oh yes, the scene really puts the spotlight on, are we close to people? Are we distant from people? And just in terms of physical proximity, Lily and William feel they've intruded on a privacy, even though it's actually Mr. Ramsey who was intruded on them, because he's the one who's storming around. And so they move away, but they ultimately wind up bumping into him. And maybe I can bring in the idea of myopia, because I just love, Eret, that you're giving me the chance to think about that, because Mr. Ramsey is not keeping track of his surroundings very much, or he's deliberately veiling himself, right? There's this description of, I think he sees Lily and William, but then he averts his gaze. It's like a willful, deliberate, and again, it's because he's performing or he's moving. Maybe I'm drifting away from performing, but I am thinking about a key aspect of his performance, which was all so much about motion. And then in contrast, Mrs. Ramsey, there is a reference in these chapters to her not being able to see at a distance. As she keeps her gaze on Mr. Ramsey. She doesn't understand what the words mean, but she keeps her gaze on Mr. Ramsey as he gets closer and closer to her. And I think it's like this, and she's able to know so much about emotionally where he is and what he needs, even though for the life of her, the phrase is for life, where she really doesn't know what someone had blundered means, but she knows something so much better. But it has to do with him moving around, right? And her being able, I think, to maintain her gaze on him. So again, I think there's a whole lot more I could be saying about performance, but those are just some of the thoughts that I have about the particular kind of performance that we see Mr. Ramsey engaged in here. Yeah. I hope that's interesting. Yeah, please, Eret.
In terms of, because I think it might be nice if I can say that. So in terms of moving around and in terms of the bodily movement as well. So this is actually how I started thinking about wandering and the physical proximity and distance. So I was like, okay, there's distance, there's proximity, and people have written about it. I can't say from the top of my head who, but there's a lot about this distance and proximity idea, and like how bodies are physically distant or not, or are you kind of emotionally close or not. So it's also related to this, the question of bodies. Are bodies close or not? And in what way are they close? Or like in what way are people, characters close to each other? And then in terms of the word wandering, so, there's, and I can't pronounce it, I think, with my accent, the difference, but, there's this wandering, which is with O, but there's also wandering, like, you know, walking around wandering. So there's also this, and you know, it's like, and it does involve bodies. It's one of the, this is the affective element, you know, being in touch with the other person or with the thing or nature, whatever like that. And yeah, and also Paola's, you know, Dionysian reading, it's also, there's also this element of the sensuous and this kind of, so yeah, there's definitely this connection.
Thanks. So I can see that Paula has her hand up, and there's one more question in the chat, but we probably won't have time for that. So maybe could Chris answer into the chat as well?
I'll work on that.
Thank you. So Paula, please.
This is more of just a comment because I didn't want to leave without saying, Eret and Chris, your presentations were phenomenal. I really enjoyed them and learned a lot from them. With Eret, I really enjoyed how like you compared like wonder in terms of like terror, and but also wonder as it being a good thing. And with like, you see that with Mrs. Ramsey and Mr. Ramsey, because like she's always like, I think she even says that how like masculine intelligence is like so sterile, like nothing comes out of it because they're trying to understand something and they're so focused on understanding it that they don't see like the beauty of like nature or like the things that we can't understand, like just sitting back and kind of like basking in that. I think I remember when like after the dinner scene where they're just Mrs. Ramsey's returned to her room and she's reading her book and she's like, she doesn't understand it, but she's like happy, like she's like happy reading it. And Mrs. Ramsey's like, why are you smiling? You don't understand any of it. So I think it's so interesting to think about it like that. I didn't cross my mind before. And then with like Chris's presentation, I really like how you compared like war, but like brought it to like the domestic sphere. Because like in certain parts of the novel, it definitely seems like there's not like physical war or physical violence, but like this with how Mrs. Ramsey and like the other characters talk to each other, it almost seems strategic. Like they're trying to like dance around something because like specifically with like Charles, where he's trying to assert himself, trying to seem like better than he is, like he has like a clear objective to like get something out of people, to like praise him. So I couldn't help to think about it like that. So thank you, Yen.
Perfect, thanks. So yeah, I'm really happy for this very rich discussion. I think we could even continue and continue, but unfortunately the time is gone. And there's a great, let's say, discussion of Rita's translation workshop, which some of us are going to attend. But thank you very much. The papers were really amazing, so congratulations. And it was a pleasure to chair this panel. So thank you very much for the presentation. And hopefully see you even next time with some follow-up to your to your presentations. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Someone's saving the chat. So for some reason, I want to, I mean, not for some reason I want to, I do, but I don't, for some reason, I can't figure out how to do that.
You can save it with the 3 dots that are on the side.
Oh, that's it.
I saved it, Chris, and I can email it to you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, no problem.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you,
everyone.